All right, so I want to welcome people to, today is Tuesday, March 16th. This is the steering group to the Select Committee on the Future of Public Higher Education in Vermont. So I want to welcome everyone. I also want to welcome a special welcome to Chancellor Sophie Zanotny. We've asked her to come to share. We're going to spend some time talking about the metrics that are in the proposed metrics that are in our new report. And also, I know that she has been also working on some metrics with some folks in the legislature. So we thought it'd be really helpful to have her here so that we make sure that we're not working, going down parallel tracks with that. And so I was really, thank you, Sophie, for joining us. So today, we're gonna have Brian walk us through some of the changes. I hope you've all had a chance to see the changes that they've made to the draft. I want to make sure that people, that if there's questions and things, that we get those cleared up. Have a discussion with Sophie around metrics. That is a really important thing to make sure we are, that they don't need to be identical, but they need to be aligned. So that's what I want to make sure that we are close on that. We did have one thing that I added to the agenda, and that is that we, and I'll go into more detail, a contract amendment for NCHEMS, and we can talk about the reasons for that. And then talk about just our next steps. So before I turn it over to Brian and Dennis, are there questions or is there any adjustment to the agenda that someone wants to make? Okay. Oh, and I do want to remind people, members of the public, if you have comments or questions, please be sure that you submit them in writing. And it's the address is at the bottom of our agenda, which is posted on our website. But for those of you, if you're not there right now, it's the address is higher ed is all one word, committee at leg.state.vt.us. So we will be happy to take any comments or questions, and we will distribute those to the committee. And if questions come up, Joyce Manchester is mining that that address, and so she will share those with the group at the end. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Dennis, Brian, Sally, however you want to walk us through the changes that have been made to the report so far.
Oh, Brian.
All right, well, thank you very much. I want to call your attention to my brand new, really old, resurrected headset. So hopefully you can all hear me far more clearly than in the past. I want to tell you this is coming at some sacrifice to my ears, but that's okay. It's more important that you all hear me well. I should have done this. I should have tracked this thing down a while ago. It was a detritus in our office we tracked down. Also, the background is new for me because there's too much backlight with all the snow that we've got in Colorado over the weekend. But with that in mind, the volume of changes I think you'll notice have been progressively getting less intense for the review of this document. And I hope that you are all as pleased with that as I have been in terms of generating those changes. I think the principle, I'll just walk through what they are, and then we'll dig into the discussion. I think the main thing to talk about, as Joyce mentioned, is the set of metrics that we put on the table, and we were building these since the submission of the last report, I believe. And at the same time and in parallel, Sophie and her team were working on metrics of their own. And so it just made sense to us that rather than have me try to represent the metrics that Chancellor Zanotny has been putting together, that she join us and speak. She can speak better for herself than through me as a channel. So we'll get into that, and I'll walk through what we were doing in a minute. I want to make sure, and I think that the email suggested this, that you all see that in the draft report, there is a statement that's currently presumptuous about the select committee as a whole endorsing the report. It's right now as a placeholder in hopes that by the time the select committee meets again and sees this report, they'll find none of the changes to be such that they would withdraw their support that they've so far provided. But it's in there, and we know that we haven't quite gotten all the way there yet, but nevertheless, there is, based on feedback we received, a revision to the recommendation relating to the FAFSA requirement. And I saw news today that Massachusetts is considering something similar and in their session at the moment. And so we tried to soften the language a little bit to suggest that the legislature could provide direction and the issue can be studied and addressed. We are not sure whether or not that recommendation or the legislature could put a statement of intent into the record during this session or not. But ideally, we would hope that they could, and then Heather and Chancellor Statney and Scott and others could get together and work on the actual shape of what that requirement might look like in time for the next session. And then finally, there's a bunch of new content where we're largely cleaning up placeholder type things that were in the report outline form due to the aggressive timeline we've been under. We've turned some of those things into prose. None of that stuff should come as a surprise, but I do hope you read it and would alert us that if anything stood out to you as being problematic, you would say so. Primarily, these are in the area of the introduction, a discussion of the review of documents that we undertook and which NEBI also contributed substantially to. And then since the document you've received so far, we've continued to try to flesh out a little bit of the sort of the awkward presentation of some of the sections that were originally just there sort of to alert folks to what kind of content was to follow, but not without the sort of poetic license that you might expect in a report of this nature. And so with that, I think that's the sort of the intro to the changes that you should have seen and reflected on. As I said, I think the bulk of our interest is in talking through the metrics. And but before we jump into that, did anybody have any comments, questions, concerns, or anything with any of the other content areas that you saw having been changed? Mass Breyer.
This is more of a question. I'm not sure it's a change in the content from the last revision, but when you look at table 3, the table that talks about what the state investment's going to be in both transformation and ongoing support, there's a line item for affordability, at $5 million a year. But then when you go further in the report and look at, say, figure 4 or figure 5, which follow immediately after, the affordability $5 million is no longer represented in those figures, in those graphs. And so my question is, was that a conscious decision of the report writers, or do we want to represent the request consistently throughout the report?
So I think that there's the answer to that is it was a conscious decision because that $5 million was intended to be directed to VSAC for bolstering its need-based aid programs in the state, particularly as it somewhere says in the document around need-based aid to Vermont residents attending Vermont institutions. And so separately, there is, of course, the recognition that in the course of transformation, the Vermont State College system is expected to grow more affordable, and at a minimum preserve the level of affordability it currently has. And there's a metric in there we'll definitely discuss about that. But in directing the funds to the system or to the institutions, the state loses a little bit of its ability to define the parameters and criteria on which those dollars are awarded. And we believe that the need-based aid program could really help the state address directly the affordability challenges that remain for low-income and middle-income students through the need-based aid program in Vermont. So that's why it's not in table 4 and 5, because it's not money that would go to VSC.
Do you think, but it is incremental funding that VSAC would need from the state in order to accomplish the goals of affordability in our report?
Yes.
Is that correct? And do you think that's clear to our legislators?
I can't say one way or the other on that point. To this point, I have not been asked a question about that line item that I recall.
I don't have a strong bias one way or the other. I just wanted to make sure we're all consciously excluding that 5 million from the other figures. And I understand your rationale for it. It makes sense. It's not money you're asking for the Vermont State College system, but it's money that we're asking for to accomplish some of the goals of the report. So I think as long as the legislature is clear that to accomplish the goals, we need all of the money to accomplish all the goals.
And Briar, you know what, maybe we have the benefit of having Sophie here. And Sophie's been doing a lot of testifying. Sophie, can you speak to that? Do you feel that I think there's clarity, but I guess I would defer to Sophie on that question.
We haven't been asked about the VSAC piece. I mean, we've been focusing on the other numbers that we have presented to them that are consistent for us. And I mean, no one has raised that explicitly with us. I do recall, and maybe it was testimony I watched, not testimony I was part of, that there are legislators that saw that 5 million in previous reports and have thought about ways that they would like to use that 5 million that was allocated for VSAC. I haven't heard that recently, but I think I was aware that there were some legislators that thought, oh, well, we could take that 5 million and we could do X with it. So, but as far as I know, we've been presenting what we're seeking and itemizing that out for legislators. And we have made clear that that additional increase in base is really intended to help us address the affordability concerns for students.
But not the 5 million that would go to VSAC. You have not
Right.
been including that in the ask around the VSC.
One of the challenges I will say is that the numbers all start to look the same. Like you have the same number, there are things that just coincidentally all happen to be 17 million or 20 million or 5 million, and it does create confusion. So we have run into that a little bit of having to separate out like which 17 million or which 5 million that we're talking about. But right now, based on what's being presented to House Appropriations, they're not looking at increasing our base right now to 17.5. They're looking to increase it by 5 million, but that's a separate 5 million than this VSAC amount. But there's recognition that they need to increase the base moving forward. But again, they can't bind future legislators. So they're looking at increasing our base by 5 million for FY22 with the thought that it would then get increased by 5 million each year until it got up to the amount that the select committee is recommending. But again, there was no guarantees there. And that is a different 5 million, so.
I think the report is accurate. It does specifically refer that money is VSAC money in one sentence. So if people read it carefully, it's very clear. I just thought that it could get lost. That 5 million could get lost in the shuffle.
So
But-
Briar, would you like to see in the report that perhaps Brian add a little language that calls a little more attention to that? Would that help?
I think you could certainly put a footnote at the bottom of those figures, 4, 5, 54, and say does not include 5 million for VSAC. That would be very, hit them over the head with it clear.
Okay.
I will say our legislators are very familiar with VSAC, so it's not as if what's VSAC. I mean, people really know who VSAC are and what they do, so that's helpful.
We will. I think we can at least add that a footnote, and maybe there's another sentence or two that can clarify and draw attention to that distinction we're talking about there. Briar will take a swing at it, see
Okay.
how it, because we've got another meeting before the select committee meets again for you all to see what we've done with that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else before we take on the metrics?
Brian, I did just, Heather let me know that she was not able to be here. And I did say to her, I haven't heard back from her, but I said, please make sure you read over the FAFSA, the addition of the FAFSA stuff, because that really is an AOE commitment. And so in some ways it's a recommendation from this group because we believe that it will, the research shows that in other states, it really helps increase the number of students who consider going on to college, but it also sort of falls under the AOE jurisdiction. So I asked her to take a look at that. So we may hear from her, but she seemed to indicate that she was supportive of it. So we may find, she may come back to us with some comments.
Okay, well, we'll be in the same spot we've been in for the last year, more or less, ready to hear them. So
yeah.
Okay, so if it's all right, we can move on to the discussion of the metrics, and I will just really briefly not read them to you because you're all capable of having read them yourselves. But we decided, first off, that they made most sense to be attached to the implementation steps under the Vermont State College Board section, because that would be the legal entity responsible for ensuring that the metrics are being achieved and sort of in partnership with the legislature. So they all start on page 103, and they also, and there's some discussion in them in the executive summary. I would say in the executive summary, what we've tried to do is strike a balance between, well, in both places really, between the need for identifying clear and measurable objectives that the legislature can identify right now and in future years as whether or not the state college system has achieved those and is, by having done so, prepared to continue making the transformation occur and receiving additional funding support. Balance that with the need to recognize that once begun, every project starts to shift immediately. The conditions may change. The pandemic, we're not through with the pandemic and its effects, and so on and so forth. And so that there needs to be some room for continued reflection on the metrics as they go forward. So we've tried to strike a balance between sort of those points of view, and also one more thing. Recognizing the fact that the steering committee or the select committee is not the best place necessarily to really get down into the detailed specifics of what those metrics ought to be. That really that's a task for the board and the chancellor's office, where the expertise really lies. But also from the perspective of the select committee, it's valuable to have that sort of publicly appointed external body to sort of say, we think that these are some reasonable and aggressive targets for the board to be pursuing, and for the legislature to be prepared to acknowledge their achievement of with further additional funding support. So that's kind of the the themes that we were trying to strike around the presentation of the metrics in the executive summary. The metrics themselves is really about this $5 million structural deficit. There was, when we got this ready for you, some discussion about the order and timing of the accreditation conversation. I think that's been resolved. So we put some dates in there related to that. We have tried to acknowledge the need to make some significant headway in that first year in certain areas that the legislature can see. We all around academic sharing and administrative services consolidation. We have tried to argue, we have tried to reflect the reality that there are concerns about brand equity, image, institutional identity, and the need to conduct a marketing campaign that sort of capitalizes as much as possible on those things. And then there is, and for the most part, I think that, and then there's one more about the physical footprint. I think for the most part, there's a reasonably decent overlap between what we put forward and what the chancellor is about to share with you in terms of where those metrics are coming, that she's prepared have come out. With one exception, and that is that we have also suggested that the metrics include something around using the affordability standard to measure progress in terms of having some sign that a college is at least $1 more affordable for low and maybe middle income students by the end of year 2 as a result of this transformational process that's underway. We included that. It's certainly, all of this is certainly up for discussion, and we'd like your feedback. But we included that, having heard from Senator Baruth and Representative James, as well as some of the other conversations about the real need to see signs of success in those terms in some, at some point relatively soon. So we thought that the select committee was a place where we could try to signal the need to make some achievements in that regard. I don't know that it's the most comfortable of the metrics for everybody, but to some degree, I think that the select committee has to do a delicate balancing act of putting things on the table that may not always be comfortable, but that are aggressive and reflect the real commitment to change that's needed in the state that we've heard throughout this process. So those are our metrics, and you've presumably read them all. I think, I don't know, it makes sense to me to have, well, I guess Sarah's got some questions before we go on. So we can take questions first and then let Chancellor Zatney talk about her metrics.
Can go either way too. And mine is a little bit of a clarifying question and a little bit of a comment. I don't know if you wanted Joyce
those
or
are great.
Brian. Okay.
Yeah.
So the two, obviously, I am focusing in on my areas of interest. The first was the workforce development. I think I'll hold my questions for that because I'll see what Chancellor Zatney has to say about that. But I'm looking at the affordability piece, and I was just testifying this morning. And this is the metric that's at the bottom of page 3. And it says that the VSC institutions are becoming at least somewhat more affordable for low-income students from Vermont as measured by VSAC using accountability standards. While I'm not intimately familiar with what the accountability standard is, I just want to raise a scenario to see how this would play out. If the legislature expands upon the COVID relief fund investment that they made last year, the initial 2.3 million, and they really do put, a couple of, $20 million into free or subsidized courses for Vermonters. Or if the legislature or the Department of Labor decides to reallocate some of our funds, which is something I am working to continue to do, so that our participants, if participating in a training program with the state colleges, can use other sources of federal funds to subsidize either enrollment in a credit-bearing or not credit-bearing course. To me, we're achieving the same end, which is low-income individuals or individuals in need are accessing services at the state colleges. It occurs to me that the accountability standard may, or my question is, will it account for some of these other investments that may similarly achieve the making college or post-secondary more affordable to Vermonters. And so you may know, Brian or Dennis or Sally, if like those other investments, which I think should be scored as wins for the state college system, would be accounted for in this. But if not, perhaps there's some way in the metrics that we can at least acknowledge that not only does the state college system need to change and investments need to be made, but all of the other partners around them, including, the Department of Labor, other education partners, need to also find ways to help support and lift up in order to achieve that same aim.
I think that's a great comment, and and the answer to the question is I don't know whether for certain whether or not those dollars would be accounted for in the way we've conceptualized the affordability standard, for at least in terms of the degree to which this report has taken on the affordability discussion and defined it. It starts, because people will understand it better, it starts with full-time students. And in some cases, you're not necessarily talking about that crowd.
Right, like apprenticeships, right?
Right. So I think that that part of what we did do elsewhere in the document was argue that start with this, but also make sure that you've included some means by which you're actually accounting for affordability of populations that aren't necessarily captured in this in the most basic form of the standard definition.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why we're trying to argue that VSAC would generate the results related to that. So there would be the affordability standard in its most basic form, and then contextual information about what happens to students more like the ones you're talking about through that process. And I believe that what would happen in a case like that is that the that the affordability standard would be presented, but so would all this other information about the ways in which the combination of resources are helping students access the programs at VSC institutions more affordably than they otherwise would, and should be satisfactory to the legislature.
Because if the 5 million is going to make a bump, and we hope that it does, and the legislature, to Briar's point, like invests in that as well, like I certainly want to make sure that we are being told, and others are being told, that we also need to figure out ways when we pull down, whether it's federal grant funds or other philanthropic funds, that there is an intermediary, and that there are ways that we can, support, the rising tide to lift this ship.
Yeah.
And just want to make sure they get credit, we get credit for that, because we're all trying to pull in the same direction.
I was actually going to suggest under this bullet, where we're talking about making it somewhat more affordable for low income students, I'd like to remove the low income and just say students, because for me right now, I feel like, for people that are very low income, they can, at CCV, they can get a full Pell Grant. It does cover their tuition. Now, it doesn't help with living expenses or anything, but it covers tuition. The group that I feel like we missed the mark with are people who don't qualify for a full Pell, but don't also make enough money to have discretionary income to be able to invest in education. And so I actually would lobby for just removing low income and just say for students from Vermont, because it is, it's more that middle slice that is of concern to me. Not that I want to make sure we can find funds for low income, but it's harder to find funds for the middle slice.
I strongly support that. And also because it invites a more informed conversation around who the constituent is for the state colleges. Because I think we're going to find, coming out of this pandemic, that many more job seekers who already had been in the workforce will be looking for retraining or new skills. And the state colleges should be a first stop in reformatting their career pathway. And the previous prism with the legislature, at least when I served, was it was all about looking at that low income student, ages 18 to 25. And if we can challenge why we want low income or first generation students and say we need to think bigger, because we're serving a larger audience in the interests of the state, I think that, if nothing else, helps us to have that conversation and shift the problem we're trying to solve and solve a bigger one.
Can I ask a clarifying question for that? I hear what you're saying. In fact, what I said is not, in introducing this, is not reflected in the metric, which was I said low and middle income students. If we take low and middle income out, we can certainly do that. I would only push back in the sense that when we look at the VSC data, and I'm sure if we looked at I think if we look at data nationally, let's just put it that way, something I know specifically about, institutional aid expenditures tend to flow up the income spectrum much more so than federal and state aid dollars. So, and this is and so if in the VSC data, we also see to a degree some of that. A lot of it's for non-residents as well. So I'm okay with taking it out. I just want to make that point and ask whether or not that gives you any pause.
Brian, it seems to me that one way out is to say affordability for students, but in a report say organized, by income group, and that lets it say for all income groups.
Got it.
It doesn't just focus on low and middle or low. It just says we're going to take a look at affordability for all students, but we want it subcategorized by income category. And that hits all the bases.
I would support that. And, and Brian, it's interesting because I look, when you just mentioned the data, I look at it through a CCV lens, which is, we don't do tuition discounting. And so what you see is the price is what you get. So, but I thank you for the reminder around tuition discounting and how that does work. So I think, I agree with what you just said. I think Dennis's solution probably speaks to both our concerns.
Yep. Any other questions or concerns? Because I think we definitely want to hear from the chancellor on this one. All right, great. And I think that as you start, Sophie, I think that the issue that we would like to hear from you all is, what do we do in terms of trying to find an alignment between what VSC is working on with the legislature and what the select committee wants to say in its report around the metrics. One way to go is to adopt one or the other. The other way to go is to say, look, these are really similar in a lot of important ways, but not precisely the same, and kind of go that direction. So anyway.
Yeah, and just one addition to that, Sophie, and I guess it is there anything about the recommendations of the select committee that is causing you grief as you talk to the legislature, or are you finding that it provides a framework that you're comfortable with and can just move forward with?
Let me see if I can cover all those bases. So first of all, just to set the scene, we've been talking to House Appropriations about, or they've been talking to us, I should say, about language they want to add to the budget. So to be clear, the metrics we've been talking about with them are really just for the budget. They're just for this year. So there's been conversations about what's needed long-term, and they want to include things right now in this budget that will, they'll be there. They won't, again, the budget is just for 1 year, but hopefully it will help set the scene for next legislative session. The thought is that the legislature will get into our statute next legislative session, so come January. So really this budget language is to kind of set the scene for that. So I guess in one answer I would have is, I think it would be valuable for the select committee to make the recommendations they feel are appropriate, because those will stay, those will still be there, you know, beyond the 1 year. So I think if you think there's things that should be in here, I would put them in here, because the language I'm talking about right now is language that's going to be attached to the budget. And again, that's just for this 1 year. The hope is it will help inform discussions of the policy committees in the next legislative session. So that's one thing. I do have some specific questions about the metrics that you have in the report, and Sarah captured one of the big questions I had. So thank you, Sarah, for bringing that up. So just to recap, we've been working with Representative Fagan, who has the higher education budget in House Appropriations. He's drafted language. I shared that with Brian. I don't know if this was the final language. I do know this morning, House Appropriations unanimously voted in support of the proposed funding for us moving forward. So it still has to go to the House, and then it has to go over to the Senate. But we did get unanimous support for $97 million today, which was wonderful. That does include $20.5 million in critical occupations and scholarships, which I think is part of what Sarah's question was, you know, if we're having this extra money come in to help people take programs, you know, certificates of value in high need areas, how does that play in with the affordability standard? So I appreciate Sarah raising that. So what Representative Fagan did was, interestingly, he came up with a list of what he thought our strategic priorities should be, and what the goals should be that they would put into the legislation. And then when he brought them to us, it was like, that's great, but those are the ones we already picked. So it kind of overlapped. So what he has is, he sets out the Vermont State College system shall transform itself in order to meet each of these strategic priorities. And then he lists what are our strategic priorities that the board has already adopted. So affordability, which we define as ensure that student costs and debt obligations are not barriers to student access. Accessibility, ensure that each VSC student has a supported educational pathway to meet the student's educational goals. Relevance, which is defined as ensure that each VSC student is prepared for lifelong career and personal success in the global 21st century. Ensure that it offers educational programs that are aligned with state workforce needs, offered in a fiscally responsible manner, and delivered in a manner that is relevant to current students and employer needs. So that's the sort of opening. And then it says the VSC shall meet the following requirements during the transformation of the system, and to accommodate oversight by the General Assembly. And one of the goals of what's included here, and just to be clear, I know the money piece went through this morning. What I don't know is if there were any changes made by the Appropriations Committee to this. So it's possible there were some changes that I'm not up to date on. So one of the goals was to make sure that we're back in front of the different committees in the legislature next spring as a way to keep the conversation going so we don't drop off the radar. So the first was the VSCS shall reduce its structural deficit by $5 million per year for 5 years through a combination of annual operating expense reductions and increased enrollment revenues for a total of $25 million by the end of fiscal year 2026. I believe that's consistent with what you have in the report. The reduction shall be structural in nature and shall not be met by use of one-time funds. And then it requires us to report on those to the House and Senate committees on education and committees on appropriations annually, so next year. The next one was that the Board of Trustees develop and implement a 10-year strategic plan for managing its physical assets that's fiscally sustainable, maintains reasonable net asset value, and meets the needs of Vermont learners. And then we have to present that to the House Committee on Corrections and Institutions and the Senate Committee on Institutions by March of next year. The next one is that we will maintain our present campus locations as educational and student support centers, recognizing that changes in governance and operational structures, as well as program and service offerings, may change as circumstances require. There was some discussion about that because, you know, really we can only do that if we continue to receive the funding that we need. But again, this is a 1-year budget, so they were not willing to include, you know, that will continue to receive. We had proposed that they include language that assumes that we continue to receive the funding recommended by the select committee, but they weren't willing to include that piece in there. But I think there's flexibility in there. Then they have, beginning in fiscal year 2022, the Board of Trustees acting through the Chancellor as part of the Chancellor's annual budget. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, and then it lists things specifically that we're going to present on to appropriations and education. And this again is very much tied to the report. So one is enrollment levels in courses offered by the VSC, reported on the basis of courses with fewer than 5 students, 5 to 9 students, 10 to 14, and then 15 and above, along with relevant information about these enrollment data. So again, that's getting to, are we moving the needle in terms of not teaching so many courses with a few students in it? The second one was demonstrate accessibility. In order to do that was the percentage of courses and programs offered by the VSC on a statewide basis and on the formats in which they're offered. So again, are we offering, students, are we offering courses statewide, and are we offering them in flexible formats? And then the next one was an assessment of affordability and accessibility within the VSC and recommendations on how to improve them. So that's a more generic one. Then they have, to help optimize student opportunities, the VSC shall complete implementation of seamless general education credit transfer between all of its constituent institutions by the end of fiscal year 2023. So we're currently working on having the one single general education core. And so, I think that's moving forward, but again, we've got to get it through all the faculty assemblies and everything else. So I think that's doable. And then ensure that we, and then we do a presentation to the House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development, the Senate Committee on Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs, that includes a report on advances in workforce readiness and meeting employer needs. And they've got including, so again, here are the specific metrics they want: employer and institutional partnerships with the VSC, progress in meeting critical employer needs, and the number of degrees and credentials of value awarded. So we would have to report back on those. And so that was information we had worked with them with the appropriations on. It largely came from them, but we provided some guidance. These are the next two additional pieces that they came up with that we did not request. Number 7 is that the trustees through the Chancellor shall provide in a summary form to the House and Senate Committees on Education and the Committees on Appropriation, VSC's profit and loss statement based on its annual October financial statement. Originally, there was interest in having reports for each institution, but again, as we're doing system-wide budgeting, it didn't really seem to make sense. So as far as, again, this could have changed, but that was what was being proposed, was that we share our profit and loss statement and discuss that with them. And then finally, the Chancellor shall ensure all VSC Board of Trustee policies are adhered to, unless a process for an exception to a board policy is used to situationally and temporarily amend a specific board policy. The Chancellor shall establish policies and procedures to implement the board-approved transformation plan as developed by the Select Committee on Higher Education. The Chancellor shall report the status or progress of these board policies as part of the Chancellor's annual budget presentation to the House and Senate Committees on Education. So those were the metrics that they were planning on including.
Any questions?
I actually don't see any of those in conflict with ours. I think ours are at a bit of a higher level, but I see those as supporting what we've put in. I'd be curious what others think, and I hadn't seen them so beforehand. So none were jarring, like, ooh, this is in conflict with what we are talking about. So I'd be curious of what others think.
Sarah.
I have a question and a comment. The first is a question, just how do you feel about it? And the comment that I have, which also kind of feeds into, I guess, is relevant to the pieces that we have in our report, is I feel like too much experience, especially of late, in having to report back on metrics to the legislature, and it can be a giant time suck. And my testimony of, for no good reason. And so both in terms of your feedback on what do you think of the metrics, but also, when we look at what we're asking or we're recommending the metrics be, I want to get a good sense of whether the workload is worth the payoff. So, if you complete a marketing strategy or complete a plan, you're going to be planning anyway, but then it takes you or high level staff an additional 30 hours to compile the information in a way to present it in a report. I just think we have to be really sensitive to the time that it takes to do the reporting on these metrics. And while I have definitely said, oh yeah, that's fine, we can report on that, when it comes down to it and there are weeks before it's time to submit answers, I rethink, like, what are people really going to do with all this time we're putting into writing up information? So I just, no, with that sensitivity, I'm just curious to see if there are things that kind of strike you as, that's not really going to be that useful, when we get to the point that the report or the metrics are reported on, and do you see that in any of ours?
Yeah, so I really appreciate you saying that. I think that it's trying to find that balance between being held accountable and,
Yeah.
we want to be held accountable because we want to continue to receive funding. And so if we're not, if we're not held accountable, then I think our ability to secure additional funding is going to be limited. I also think this was intended pretty explicitly to make sure that we are back in front of those committees, right? So it's, they have to hear from us, kind of thing. I will say that, again, as drafted, and I don't know if any changes were made to it, but as drafted, we were pretty comfortable with this. This seemed to be things that we would be doing already and that we need to do. So it's both a sort of carrot and stick. It'll help us move things along because they're things we should and could be doing. And if you've got a report, I don't think any of them are pointless. The one concern we did have was, again, around the profit and loss statement. Again, there was this sort of interest in terms of wanting to know, well, is this particular campus location, what's their profit and loss? I'm just assuming it was kind of, there's some politics going on around the transformation itself, and I think it was being driven by that. But I will say, Representative Fagan he wants to make sure that we're being held responsible, but he did not want us to have to do a whole lot of extra work that we wouldn't otherwise do. And we explained to him that, like, pulling out the individual institutions' financial information, that's a huge amount of work that we don't do. It wouldn't really serve any purpose. We've moved to a system-wide budget. It's that was kind of extra work that didn't seem to be of value at that point. But these other things, I think, are consistent both with what's in the Select Committee report. And again, we've been working with the board in identifying strategic priorities, identifying a particular focus of where we're going to really try to move the needle on things. So, for example, keeping an eye on what the enrollment in courses look like. That's something we intend to do. So, to include it here is fine. That was something we've already, working with the presidents, we'd come up with strategies for implementing our strategic priorities, and these were things we were planning on doing. So, and I will say, I know Megan has taken over our education personnel student life committee, and they're all about, let's have a dashboard, let's have some metrics. So I think we're moving to an environment where we do need to be paying attention to these things. One of the challenges we do have is we're not particularly strong, I don't think, in institutional research. So that's an area where we really need to invest some resources moving forward. But I think this is what was presented to us for appropriations was something we could do. Again, I don't know if they tinkered with it today, so I just put that caveat out there. And again, as far as what the Select Committee, what you're considering, the two questions I had was, one was the affordability accountability piece, and what that would look like, given if there's all this extra scholarship money and stuff coming in, which we've touched on. And the other one was just making clear that we are looking to, the goal is to have a common accreditation for fall of 2023. So I just wanted to make sure that the dates you had in the draft, revised report for April was consistent with that timeline. And I wasn't sure all of the dates you had here were, and I know there was some question about that moving forward. And the other point I had was just, you talk about particular June 2022, 22, 23 academic year, and then you have year 2. And what is year 2? I would just put in the academic year or whatever that relates to, because otherwise I'm not sure if year 2 is FY22 or if it's FY23.
Okay, thanks. I think that if there are dates in there inconsistent with your plans, please let us know. I think I reverted to ones that would fit with the plan as you have settled on it about the accreditation timeline. And I think I pulled that off of the implementation plan that got approved by the board in the first place. But if anything's changed, do let me know, and we can make.
Well, the one that I was particularly was the third bullet, and it's talking about academic programs, and it says draft transition plan to be ready for implementing these changes beginning in the 22-23 academic year. I think that should be 23-24, because that would be the academic year when we would be looking for the new institution to start. So,
yep. So let me ask you a question. Yes, I am wondering whether or not the way this is written suggests that you're all done with it, and that wasn't my intent. My intent was that you wouldn't have equally rapid success with all of the various disciplines within the VSC, but that some, like the business programs already being shared between the two campuses at NVU, might be the coalition of the willing and make some headway. Would it be troublesome for us to say some signs of progress by 2022-23 with full implementation under single accreditation in time for 23-24? Or
I think that would be fine. Okay. I mean, we certainly plan to move forward. Again, my goal is not to have metrics that are realistic, not ones that we're going to fail from the outset. So
yeah,
but you're right. I mean, we do have faculty that have certainly been early adopters and are thinking about ways to work together. But yeah, the notion that we would we just wanted to make sure there was enough time there to allow us to have a thoughtful process. We are working on that, the program array, because it's kind of really one of the first steps. We've got to know what programs we're developing a marketing plan for, an admission strategy. So, we have to get that work done. It has to be one of the early pieces in this.
Right. Okay, great. So we have another meeting, and I don't expect there to be a huge volume of additional changes for our next steering group meeting in 2 weeks. But some of these pieces that, Breyer's comments, the discussion of the metrics, we can make some tweaks here, and then you'll see some additional things. I will say before I forget that I'm maintaining the red line version for the select committee, not for you guys. So I may have to be a little bit more strategic about pointing out exactly where things might be changed from what you're looking at today. But I hope that's okay. But I wouldn't expect to see an enormous amount of changes between now and 2 weeks from now.
And I can circulate whenever I find out what finally got approved by way of metrics with the budget. I can send that to you, Brian, or send it to Candace or whoever's responsible for sharing with the committee, if that would be helpful.
That would be really helpful.
We're still going through the sausage making machine, so there's no guarantee that's what it'll look like at the end. But if it's already changed, at least you'll know what the current version is.
I am mindful of time, but I want to ask committee members, if you have other questions about the metrics and what's being proposed. Megan, you know, I'm curious from your standpoint, does this all come together for you, you know, on the board, on chair of EPSL? Does this all make sense to you?
It does. And I think we need to keep coalescing all of the metrics to one streamlined set, to Sarah's point. So we're not just all chasing data. But I do think it's headed in that direction.
And, you know, I would also say that, Sophie, you know, we're going to meet in 2 weeks and you're welcome to come to that meeting just to make sure that we are, because I think this is a particularly important section for this final draft. And so having you as part of the conversation, if you want to join us, I don't know what your schedule is, but that would be great.
So Tuesday, the 30th. Yeah, I'm available. If it's 3 to 4 again, that I'm available. At least right this minute I am.
I'll send you the calendar invite right now. So
Okay.
you have it.
Oh, Candace, thank you.
I mean, things are changing very rapidly. So again, it may not be a bad idea for us to just fill you in terms of what's, you know, what's happening, you know, so.
I want to be mindful of time. Brian, anything else you need from this group around the draft?
No, I think that you'll, like I said, I don't think that what I heard was a whole lot of changes from on any of this stuff. So please do get in touch if you need to see some kind of alignment that is way off that you've noticed between what Sophie said and what's written in this draft, relative to what Megan just said. But other than that, I think you've got most of the content changes that you're likely to see. So in some respects, this could be a little bit of a deeper conversation next week, with including whatever events have unfolded in the legislature.
And I also, our final agenda item is, I just wanted to bring it to the attention of this group. And I guess if anybody has an issue with it, please let me know, or you can talk about it now. But after consulting with Joyce Manchester and JFO, we are proposing to make a contract amendment with NCHEMS and increasing their pay by around 10%, because what we realized when we went back to the contract that we signed with them, they have just gone above and beyond, and we have expected them. I don't think any of us, I would say, people at JFO, me, other people, ever thought, and I think NCHEMS would agree, that they would be testifying as much as they have and in front of as many groups. And I've just been amazed at how Brian has made himself available to everyone. He spent hours and then talking with our board. And so we came up with the proposal to increase their pay, do an extra payment of $24,360. And the justification comes from, and I'll read this, this was from Joyce Manchester at Joint Fiscal. The justification comes from meetings with and responding to legislative committees, other stakeholders, and the public for up to 14 days between December 4th and May 31st, 2021, rather than we had proposed 3 days in the original proposal was between April 16th and May 31st. So I just, I guess I would ask steering committee members if anybody has any questions or hesitations around increasing that. And if you'd rather, if you have some private comments, you're welcome to do it. You can contact me directly. But if I don't hear from people in the next 24 hours, we're going to move forward with this adjustment. So please let me know. But does anyone have any questions about it right now?
That makes sense to me.
I know I'm not a member of the steering group, but I would just say I'm really appreciative for Brian's willingness to go and testify. I think it's, it's a relatively, well, it is a very small amount when you think about the funding that's currently on the table for the Vermont State Colleges, and we would not be in this position had we not had the select committee's work, the work of the report, and then I think Brian testifying in front of all the committees. So I think it's well deserved. So I know it comes out of VSC funds, but we wouldn't have had as many funds had we not had your support. So.
And I would echo that. And even in the conversation with the board, I think those are the conversations that take this from a report to something that folks are getting behind and moving forward. So I think the value of that additional time is well beyond what's being proposed here.
So I don't obviously have any questions, but I want to thank you all for considering it and for your kind words and support. We have worked very hard on this, and I am feeling like a temporary resident of Vermont, as you can see from my background over the last several months.
Any other comments about this? Okay. Joyce, have we had any public comments?
No public comments today.
All right, I again, once again, want to thank committee members. I want to thank the folks from NEBI, Candace and Michael. You have been a tremendous asset to moving this along. We are, I can see the end in sight for us. We have one more steering committee meeting and then one more regular committee meeting. And then I think our work will be done as far as this particular assignment. We'll see what's in store for us beyond that. But I really want to thank you. And then, of course, we owe a great deal of gratitude to NCHEMS for their commitment. And I just want to be really clear with the steering committee, but I think you probably know this. This did not come from NCHEMS. I think Joyce and I were chatting about how much NCHEMS has done beyond what the original contract called for, and have done it without grumbling or saying, geez, they've just been very willing. And so I just feel like it's been a great partnership. And I do feel like we wouldn't be where we are today without that support and guidance. So I wish I could, I'll give everybody on the committee a 10% raise too. So, don't spend it all, as my father would say, don't spend it all in one place. But thank you so much. And with that, we'll adjourn and we'll see people in a couple weeks. Brian, you will send something out to folks before the meeting. And Sophie, if you can join us, that would be great. And onward we go.
Thank you, everybody.